An Official's Blessing. Jiangguan Sifu by Mo Xiang Dong Xiu. Read by Plant Bones. Chapter 2. Three Clowns, Night Discussion on the Palace of Tremendous Masculinity. Ever since then, things had gone out of control. Less than 100 years after the first incident, there had been a total of 17 brides who went missing in the Mount Yujun area. Sometimes there'd be a couple of decades of peace, and sometimes two would go missing in a short span of 1 month. A horrific legend quickly spread of the ghost groom who lived on Mount Yujun, and if a woman caught his eye, he would kidnap her on the road and devour the marriage procession. Ordinarily, this affair wouldn't have been reported to the heavens. Although 17 brides had gone missing, there were thousands more who were perfectly fine. Either way, the girls couldn't be found, and they couldn't be protected even if everyone wanted to do so. They could only make do with the status quo. Now there were fewer families willing to marry their daughters into this area, and the locals didn't dare make a fanfare of their weddings. That was all. But it just so happened that the father of the 17th bride was a lord official who doted on his daughter. When he heard the local legend, he meticulously selected 40 valiant and capable military officers to escort the marriage procession of his daughter. But the daughter was spirited off anyways. This ghost groom had really stirred up the hornet's nest this time. No one this old lord official sought in the mortal realm could do anything about it. So in a fit of outrage, she assembled a group of government friends and conducted a wave of crazed religious services. He even followed the guidance of a great master and opened his stores to feed the poor, among other similar deeds. It was a huge uproar that shook the city until finally this alerted a few heavenly officials above. Without going to such ends, it was practically impossible for the voices of insignificant mortals to reach the ears of gods in heaven. That's the gist of it, Shillian said. Since those two still looked very uncooperative, he couldn't tell if they actually had been listening. If they didn't listen, he'd have to tell the story again. Nanfeng looked up, though, and frowned. Are there any similarities between the missing brides? There are those who are poor and those who are rich, those who are beautiful and those who are ugly, those who are lawful wives and those who are concubines. In short, there's no pattern, Shillian said. We can't determine at all what this ghost groom's preference is. Nanfeng and picked up his teacup to take a sip, seeming to be thinking now. Fu Yao, on the other hand, never touched the tea Shillian had pushed in his direction, and had been languidly cleaning his fingers with a white handkerchief this entire time. He said coolly as he wiped, Your Highness, how would you know that it must be a ghost groom? This can't be certain, since no one's ever seen it before. So how can we know if it's male or female, if it's young or old? Aren't you a little too quick to judge? Shillian grinned. This scroll is a summary provided by a civil official from the palace of Lingwen. The ghost groom is just a common name for it. However, what you've said makes a lot of sense. They spoke a bit more, and Shillian realized that these two junior marshal officials' reasonings and logics were quite coherent. While they didn't appear very friendly, they weren't muddled at all when discussing important matters. Shillian felt relieved. Looking out the window, the hour was getting late, so the three left the small shop for the time being. Shillian put on his bamboo hat and walked for a bit before abruptly realizing the two behind him weren't following. So he looked back, puzzled. Turns out the other two weren't also watching him with equal bemusement. Nanfeng asked, Where are you going? To find some place to settle for the night? Shillian replied. Fu Yao, why are you rolling your eyes again? Nanfeng continued his question, still puzzled. Then why are you heading into the wild bushes? Shillian often camped out in the wild and slept on the streets, and he could lay on a cloth on the ground and spend the night just like that. So naturally, he was ready to find some cave to start a campfire in, as he'd always done. But it was with Nanfeng's reminder that he suddenly realized that Nanfeng and Fu Yao were both martial officials under a martial god. If there were any Nanyang temples or Zhuanjin temples around, then they would enter directly. So what need was there to heap out in the wild? A short while later, the three found a broken down Tudi shrine, an incredibly inconspicuous little corner that worshipped a round, small stone lord of soil and ground. With incense residue and shattered platters, it looked exceedingly desolate. Celian called out a few times. This lord of the soil and ground hadn't been worshipped or called by anyone for years. So when he suddenly heard the call, he snapped his eyes open and saw three people standing before his shrine. The two on the left and right, respectively, both enveloped in a sheen of spiritual light, abundant like some nouveau riche, their faces barely visible. The deity jumped in alarm. His voice trembled. Do the three heavenly officials have anything to command of this humble one? Shilian inclined his head. No commands. I just wanted to ask if there are any local temples that worship either General Nanyang or General Zunjin. The Lord of Soil and Ground didn't dare to affront him and replied, then a quick divination with a pinch of his fingers, and he answered, There's a local temple. There's a local town temple about 2.5 kilometers from here, and the one worshipped is General Nanyang. Celian put his hands together in prayer. Many thanks. However, the Lord of Soil and Ground was blinded by the two balls of spiritual power on both sides of Celian, so he quickly vanished. Celian fumbled out a few coins and placed them in front of the altar shrine, and when he saw there were fallen remnants of burned incense sticks on the ground, he picked them up and relit them. Throughout the entire thing, Fu Yao was rolling his eyes so hard, Celian almost wanted to ask if his eyes were tired. About 2.5 kilometers later, they indeed spotted a local town temple standing fiery red by the roadside. While the temple was small, it had everything. People were going in and out, extraordinarily lively. The three concealed their forms and entered the temple. The one worshipped within the hall was a clay statue of the martial god Nanyang, bedecked in armor and with bow in hand. When Cilian saw the divine statue, he hummed inwardly. In a small temple in the countryside, the craft and painting of divine statues could be expected to be rough. But on the whole, this statue was still significantly different from Cilian's own interpretation of Feng Xin. However, distorted divine statues were something that every heavenly official had long since gotten used to. Never mind their own mothers wouldn't recognize them sometimes. There were heavenly officials who didn't even recognize themselves when they saw their own statues. After all, there were many artists and masters who had actually there weren't many artists and masters who had actually seen the real forms of the heavenly officials. So the statues were either distorted beautifully or hideously. One could only rely on the posture, spiritual apparatus, attire, and crown to determine which heavenly official it was. Usually, the more affluent the area, the more the divine statue would please the heavenly official. The more impoverished the place, the worse. The worse the taste of the craftsmanship, and the more tragic the sculpture became. To speak of the present, there was only General Zhuangzhen whose divine statues were in a better situation. Why? Because for everyone else, if their statues were ugly, then whatever, leave it be. But when Mu Qing saw that his statues were had been hideously sculpted, he would either secretly destroy them and make people start over, or appear in people's dreams to express his displeasure. This went on for a long time until the grand believers all learned that they had to find an artisan master who could sculpt beautifully. All the temples of Shenzhen were exactly the same as their original, particular and tasteful. But after Fu Yao entered the temple of Nanyang, for 2 whole hours he thoroughly criticized the statue of Nanyang from head to toe. How the design was deformed, the colors tacky, the craftsmanship crude, the taste bizarre. Cilian watched as blue veins on Nanfeng's forehead slowly popped up, and thought he best quickly find another topic of conversation. It just so happened that there was a girl who entered to pray, and she very sincerely knelt. Cilian said warmly, Speaking of Nanyang, Sunjin's main domain is in the southeast. I never imagined you guys would have such following in the north, too. When people constructed temples, they were imitating the divine palaces of the heavenly realm, and the divine statues were reflections of the heavenly officials' venerable selves. Temples attracted worship and were belie- Temples attracted worship and were where believers gathered, becoming an important source of spiritual power for heavenly officials. And due to various reasons, such as geography, history, and customs, people of different regions often worship different gods. A heavenly official's spiritual power would be maximized on their own turf. This was the main advantage of having a domain. Only to a heavenly official like the heavenly emperor, who had believers from all over the world and possessed temples everywhere, was the notion of a main domain meaningless. It was a good thing that the Holy Temple of Nanfeng's own general was so popular, even outside his own domain. He should have been proud, but judging by his expression, this was very much not the case. On the side, Fu Yao gave a light smirk. Yes, yes, he's deeply loved. Celine said, but I have a question that I don't know if. If you're going to say you don't know if it's appropriate, then don't say anything. Nanfeng interrupted. No, I was going to say I don't know if anyone has the answer, Celine thought. But he had a feeling that it'd be bad if he said it, so in the end he decided to change the subject again. Yet, unexpectedly, Fu Yao languidly said, I know what you want to ask. You must be wondering there are so many female believers coming into worship. That was indeed the question Cillian had in mind. There had always been fewer female believers than male in martial god streams. Only Cillian himself was an exception. 800 years ago, however, the reasoning for this exception was very simple. It was also only two words: good looking. He knew very well that it wasn't because he was distinguished or because he had extraordinary spiritual powers. It was merely due to the fact that his divine statue was good looking, and his palace temples were handsome too. Practically all of his palace temples were constructed by the royal family, and the highest skilled experts and artisans in the kingdom were summoned to sculpt the divine statues exactly in accordance with his face. Besides, because of the phrase body in abyss, heart in paradise, the artisan liked adding flowers to his divine statues and planting seas of flowering trees at his temple. Thus, at the time, he had another title, the flower-crowned martial god. The lady believers liked his divine statue, liked that his divine statues were good-looking, and his palace temples were filled with flowers. Due to that alone, they were willing to casually enter to pray. The usual martial gods were too heavy in killing aura and often had their faces sculpted by serious, savage, and cold. So when lady believers saw, they would rather pray to the Buddhavistas instead. While the statue of Nanyang had none of the killing aura, it was far from good looking, and yet there still seemed to be more female believers praying than male. Nanfeng obviously didn't want to answer the question either, which was making Xilian even more curious. It just so happened that right then, that girl finished her worship. She rose to her feet to reach for the incense, then spun around. While she was turned away, Cillian nudged the other two. They were already annoyed, and with his nudge, looked down, and whoosh, both their faces dropped. Too ugly, Fu Yao exclaimed. Cillian choked for a moment, then chided. Fu Yao, you can't talk about girls like that. If he had to be honest, what Fu Yao said was true. The girl's face was incomparably flat, looking exactly like someone had leveled it with a slap. It would have been almost an insult to say her features were plain. They must be described, and only a crooked nose and slanted eyes could be used. However, Cillian didn't register whether she was beautiful or ugly at all. The main thing was, when she spun around, there was an enormous tear on the back of her skirt. He really couldn't pretend he didn't see it. Fuya was startled at first, but he quickly regained himself. The veins popped on the corner of Nanfeng's forehead and instantly vanished. Seeing the face didn't Seeing his face change colors so drastically, Xilian quickly soothed. Don't be nervous, don't be nervous. The girl took incense and knelt down anew, and she said, Instead, as she prayed, "May General Nanyang give his blessings. This believer Xiaoyang prays for that the ghost groom be captured soon, so no other innocents will be harmed by him." She was sincere and devout in her prayers, and didn't sense anything peculiar going on behind her at all. Nor was she aware that there were three men crouching next to the foot of the design statue she was praying to. Cillian fretted. What do we do? We can't let her walk out like this. Everyone on her way home will see. Besides, judging by the tear on the back of her skirt, it was obvious someone had intentionally ripped it with a sharp object. She probably wouldn't just be seen by a crowd of onlookers. She would also be publicly laughed at, and that would truly be considerable humiliation. Fu Yao was unconcerned. Don't ask me. She's praying to. The one she's praying to isn't my General Zhen. Do not look at what's improper. I saw nothing. Meanwhile, blood was draining from Nanfeng's handsome face. He only knew to wave, not to talk. A perfectly fine, unbridled, strapping young man was forcibly rendered mute, completely hopeless. So Xilian had no choice but to take action himself, taking off his outer robe and throwing it down below. The outer robe flapped in the air for a moment and drifted back and drifted down onto the body of that girl, blocking the very inelegant tear on the back of her skirt. The three sighed a breath in unison. However, the breeze was strange, and it startled the girl. She looked around, took off the robe, and hesitated briefly before she placed it onto the altar. She was completely unaware. After sticking the incense in the burner, she made her way out. If they let her out to walk around like that, the little maiden would probably have no face to look anyone ever again. The two on Xilian's right and left were either frozen or frozen, completely useless, however you wanted them. And he sighed. Namfang and Fu Yao felt the space beside their bodies was suddenly empty. Xilian had already taken form and jumped down. The lamplight inside the temple was dim. A small gust rose from his leap, causing the firelight to flicker. The girl, Xiaoyang, only saw a blur before a man suddenly emerged from the darkness, reaching out to her with his upper body bare, and she was scared out of her wits' end then and there. As expected, she screamed. Just when Xilian was about to speak, the girl's slap already struck out with a flash, and she yelled, "Harassment!" Whack! And Xilian was slapped just like that. The slap was clear and crisp. The two crouching on top of the altar both felt the side of their face twitch at the same time. Xilian wasn't mad at the strike, however, and only forcefully stuffed the outer robe into her arms, swiftly whispering something. The girl was greatly alarmed, felt her behind, and suddenly flushed red in the face. Tears welled up in her eyes. Who knew whether it was anger or indignation? She clutched the outer robe Xilian gave her and dashed out, covering her face, leaving Xilian standing there, half bare. With the girl gone, the temple was now deserted. A cool breeze wafted through the hall, and it was suddenly a little chilly. He rubbed his cheek, and with that red hand mark on half his face, he turned to the other two. All right, everything's resolved. Nanfeng pointed at him. Did you tear your wounds? Xilian looked down and owed. After undressing, what was revealed was a body of smooth and fair like jade, except his chest was heavily wrapped in layer after layer of white cloth, firmly bound. Even his neck and wrist were wrapped in bandages. Innumerable small cuts crawled out from the edges of the white bandages. Truly a startling sight. He figured his sprained neck was pretty much covered by now, so Xilian started unbinding his bandages. Fu Yao glanced at him, then questioned. Who was it? What? Who fought you? Fu Yao demanded. Fought? Xilian was confused. No one? Then all those injuries on your body. Nanfeng was hesitant. Xilian looked at them blankly. I fell on my own. Those were indeed the injuries from when he tumbled down from heaven 3 days ago. If it were from a fight with another person, then he might not actually have been hurt so badly. Fu Yao grumbled something, but it wasn't clear. Either way, it definitely wasn't praising him for his fortitude, so Xilian didn't bother to ask, focusing only on removing the heavy layer of bandages from his neck. The next second, Nanfeng and Fu Yao's gazes hardened as their eyes fell on his throat. A black collar encircled his snow-white neck. Sensing their stare, Xilian gave a light smile and turned around. First time seeing a real cursed shackle? Cursed shackle, like its name implied, was a shackle formed by a particular curse. Heavenly officials who were banished from heaven would have the would have the mark of sin forged by the wrath of heaven branded onto their bodies. This brand formed a fetter that sealed spiritual powers away, never to be freed. Just like a brand on the face, or chains shackling the hands and feet, this was a form of punishment and a warning. It was both terrifying and humiliating. As the laughingstock of the three realms, who was banished twice, of course, Celian had a cursed shackle on his body. It was impossible for the two junior martial officials to have not heard of this before, but there was a little difference between having heard and having seen it personally. Thus, Celian could understand why they would react the way they did. He figured this might be making the two junior officials wary and uncomfortable. After all, it wasn't like those shackles were a good thing. At first, he used the excuse of going out to search for clothes in order to get a chance to step outside, but he was stopped in his tracks by Fu Yao's eye roll at his comment. It'd be incredibly indecent for you to go out in the street looking like that. In the end, it was thanks to Nanfeng, who tossed him a temple attendant's robe that he grabbed from the back of the building, that Xilian was able to stop being so indecent. However, even after they'd settled back down, it felt like the incident earlier had caused the mood to become somewhat awkward. And so Xilian took out the scroll given by the Palace of Lingwen. He said, "Do you guys want to take another look at this?" Nanfeng raised his eyes and gave him a look. "I've looked through it already. I think he's the one that needs to take a better look at it." "What do you mean I'm the one who needs to take a better look at it?" Fu Yao countered. "The scroll isn't detailed at all. It's completely worthless, and you think it's worth another look?" Hearing him say the scroll was worthless, Xilian couldn't help but feel a little sad for the ashen-faced junior officials at the Palace of Lingwen who put this together. Fu Yao then continued, "Oh yeah? Where are we? The Temple of Nanyang? Why does the Temple of Wait. Fu Yao. Oh yeah, where were we? The Temple of Nanyang. Why does the Temple of Nanyang have so many female believers, right?" All right, Celian put the scroll away and rubbed his pulsing forehead. He understood now. No one would be able to look through it tonight. If they weren't going to focus on real business, then I not see what the side business was all about. Turned out, other than the Royal Highness who spent centuries collecting scraps in the mortal realm, every deity knew there was a period of time that when Nanyang Zwenjian, Fengxin, was called Juyang Zwenjian. The man himself deeply detested this title, and everyone only heard of one word for his experience: injustice. The original correct writing used the characters Juyang, which meant perfect sun. The incident that warped them happened many years ago. During that time, a king was constructing a great number of temples and palaces. To demonstrate his faith and sincerity, he personally drafted the titles for every temple or palace's establishment plaque. But when it came time Palace of Juyang, for some reason he used the characters for Juyang that meant tremendous masculinity. This gave the officials responsible for the construction much grief. They couldn't figure out whether His Majesty changed it intentionally or if it was an accident. If it was intentional, wasn't there a clear decree that that indicated yes, this was what we wanted to change it to? If it wasn't intentional, why would their king commit such a low-level mistake? It wasn't like they could say, Your Majesty, you're wrong. Who knew if His Majesty had mistake them for being sarcastic about his carelessness? That they were hinting at his knowledge was shallow, that his heart was insincere. This was His Majesty's royal writing. Were they going to trash it if they weren't going to use it? Divine beings had hearts most difficult to discern, and the officials were in pure agony. After much deliberation, instead of causing grief to His Majesty, they thought they might as well cause grief for Jiang Swenchen. It had to be said that they made the right decision. When the king discovered that that perfect sun had become tremendous masculinity, he didn't make any statements, but instead invited a bunch of scholars to scour the ancient texts with great vigor to find countless minuscule reasons and and compose many essays to painstakingly prove that it should have been tremendous masculinity in the first place, and that perfect sun was wrong. In any case, every palace of perfect sun in the country became a palace of tremendous masculinity overnight. Fengxin, whose divine title changed so randomly, didn't find this out until decades later. He basically had never bothered to look closely at the signs of his own temples, but one day he felt rather baffled. Why were there so many women coming to pray in his temples, each of them flushed with shyness on their cheeks? And what in the world were they praying for when offering incense? He figured it After he figured it out, he charged up to the peak of the ninth sky and shouted curses into the scorching sun and the vast skies. He shocked every heavenly official. After he was done cursing, there was nothing he could do, so he could only relent. It wasn't like he could pick on those women who were praying so sincerely, so he forced himself to listen for many years. It wasn't until a decent ruler came along who thought tremendous masculinity was horribly exceeded that it was changed to Nanyang for Southern Sun. Nonetheless, no one forgot what else he could grant beyond his duties as a martial god. However, everyone also upheld an unspoken rule: never call him by that name. At the same time, they also upheld general consciousness. How to evaluate this Nanyang Zhuanzhen? One word: good! Don't let him open his mouth to yell at people, and everything should be good. Namfeng's face was already as dark as the bottom of an aged wok. Yet Fu Yao suddenly feeling poetic, and he recited demurely, "Friend of woman, a trusty companion, ask for a son most powerful as he, the secret formula to bolster masculinity. A son in your prayers none young delivers." Xilian very kindly held back his laugh, leaving a bit of face for Nanyang in front of his divine statue. Nanfeng, however, was outraged. "Don't you act all sarcastic here. If you really are that bored, go sweep the floor." The moment those words were spat out, Fu Yao's face also darkened to the color of a pot bottom. If the palace of Nanyang couldn't stand to hear the words tremendous masculinity, then the palace of Swenchen couldn't stand to hear people bring up the term sweep. This was because when Muting was still an errand boy at the Royal Holy Temple, all he did for days was serve tea, deliver water, sweep, and change the sheets for Xilian at the palace of the Crown Prince. One day, Xilian saw him silently reciting training incantations while sweeping. He was thus moved by his spirit for learning and hard work under such difficult circumstances and persuaded the state preceptor to take him in as a disciple. How best to describe this incident? It could be considered grand or insignificant, could be considered humiliating or a compliment. It depended entirely on the individual in question. Obviously, the individual in question had taken it as the humiliation of his life, since Muqing and every martial warrior under his command would flip out when they hear the word sweep. Sure enough, Fu Yao steadied himself. Then, after throwing a look at Xilian, who was waving his hand, appearing fully innocent, he sneered. Wait, which one? Listening to you, those who don't know would think that your palace of Nanyang sides with the palace of the crown prince and fights hard for his right to the injustices against him. Nanfeng sneered too. Your general is certainly the ungrateful one that bites the hand that feeds him. What more can I say? Celian was just trying to intercept when Fu Yao had and said, "The cat calling the pot black. What right do you have to point fingers?" Listening to them turn into a small mallet with Listening to them turn him into a small mallet with which they took turns to beat the heavenly official standing right standing up right there on the altar. Celian finally couldn't take it any longer. Wait, hold up, stop. Of course, no one paid him any mind, and they even started throwing fists. Who knew who threw the first punch? But either way, the altar was split in half, just like that. Platters of fruit rolled all over the ground. Seeing how there was no way he could stop the fight anymore, Shilian sat himself in a corner and heaved a sigh. What a sin. Then he picked up a small steam bun that had rolled to his feet. He dusted off its skin and was about to bite down when Nanfeng saw him from the corner of his eye and immediately slapped it away. Don't eat that! Fu Yao stopped too and appeared shaken and disgusted. How can you eat that when it's rolled in the dirt? Celian used this chance to raise his hand. Stop. I have something to say. He separated the two and said, looking amicable, First, that Highness the Crown Prince you two speak of happens to be me. This Highness hasn't even said anything, so don't go slinging me around like a weapon to attack each other. He paused for a moment and then added, I don't think your generals would ever have behaved like this. If you two act so indecorously, you'll ruin their reputations. When those words were spoken, the face of the other two changed to something indiscernible. Shilian continued, Second, you two are here to help me, right? So it is you who listens to me, or is it me who listens to you? It was a moment before the two who replied, We listen to you. While their faces looked like they were saying, Listen to you, dream on. Shilian was already very satisfied. Then he put his hands together in prayer. Good. Now, thirdly, the most important thing. If you must throw something, then please throw me instead of food. Nanfeng finally pried away the steamed bun that Shilian had clutched in his grip, hoping for the chance to eat it. He said, looking like he couldn't take much more, If it's fallen to the ground, don't eat it. Water. The next day, back at the little shop of chance encounters, the tea master was once again by the entrance, relaxing with his leg up, when he saw three approaching from a distance. The cultivator in light, simple white robes, with a bamboo hat slung on his back, led the way, while the two black-clad youths trailed behind him. That cultivator strolled up languidly, with his arms crossed, and he spoke equally languidly, sounding more idle than the old man. Shopkeeper, 3 cups of tea, please. The tea master smiled. Coming! Then he thought to himself, Those 3 silly guys are here again. What a shame. Each looks slightlier than the other, but each of their brains is more damaged than the next. What god, what ghost, what heavens? When you're crazy, what's good is a decent face? Celian still picked the spot next to the window, and after they settled, Namfeng spoke up. Why do we have to come here to discuss things? You sure there won't be people listening in? Celian replied warmly, It's fine. Even if other people hear us, they won't care, and they'll only think we're insane. In order to avoid the 3 of us continuing to waste each other's time like this, let's lay it all out, Shilian said. Now that we've calmed down overnight, have you guys thought of any ideas? Fu Yao's eyes flashed, and he said coldly, Kill it. No shit, said Nanfeng. Nanfeng, don't be so rude. Fu Yao didn't say anything wrong, Shilian said. The way to solve the problem is to kill a creature, but the bigger issue is, where do we go? What are we killing? How do we kill it? I suggest... At that moment, the sound of gongs and drums came from the main street, and the 3 looked out the window. It was a bleak and tragic wedding procession again. This party of men and horses blew their instrument to the utmost, hollering and cheering as if they were afraid people couldn't hear what they were about. Nanfeng frowned. Isn't it said that people around Mount Yujun don't make spectacles of these rituals anymore? This procession consisted of large, strong, buff men. Their expressions and muscles were both taut. Cold sweat oozed from their foreheads. It was like they weren't carrying a festive and cherry bridal sedan, but rather a guillotine that'd end their lives early. It made one wonder just what sort of person was seated in that sedan. After hesitating for a moment, just as Cillian was thinking of going to check things out, a sinister wind blew past, raising one of the curtains the side of the stand. The figure behind the curtain was laying slumped in a very strange position indeed. Her head was bent at an awkward angle, and underneath the bridal veil there were bright red lips curled in an overly exaggerated smile. The sedan tipped and the covering fell, exposing a pair of bulging eyes staring their way. From the looks of it, this was clearly a woman who had her neck wrung and was now laughing at them uproariously but soundlessly. Perhaps it was because the sedan carriers were shaking too hard, but the bridal sedan wasn't steady in the least, so the woman's head bounced along with bumps. They bumped and bumped and bumped, and thud! The head fell and rolled to the street. The headless body sitting inside the sedan also fell forward with a bang, and the whole person crashed out of the sedan.